It is time to put on our Bitcoin thinking caps and discuss where do we rank in terms of everybody else, literally everybody else when it comes to Bitcoin. Everyone wants to know where they stack up and where their personal stacking thus far and their current stacking goals. They want to know where they rank when compared to literally everybody. People with 10 times more Bitcoin than you, people with a tenth of as much Bitcoin as you, and including the famous names out there, right? Like Donald Trump, like Michael Saylor, right? And everybody else. You want to know, you want to have the validation that you're doing the right thing, that you're on a great track, and that you're going to end up with plenty of Bitcoin. So let's have a conversation about it. Where do you rank when compared to people with 10x your stack, 1/10 of your stack, and even the famous names like Donald Trump or Michael Saylor? However, there are a couple other questions that maybe you didn't ask, but I think are just as important for understanding that question. First, why do we care so much about rankings? Like, seriously, why do we care so much, right? Shouldn't we care more about absolute wealth instead of where we rank relative to others? I think that's a good question that we should address. And the other question being, why do people get so angry at wealth and income inequality in general? And why is it a problem? Or maybe wealth inequality actually isn't a problem on a properly distributed system. So in just a moment, we're going to be looking at Bitcoin. We'll be looking at the breakdown of everything. This is the chart we'll be looking at. But first, we got to talk about the wealth inequality question. Life follows a Pareto distribution. 80% of the output comes from 20% of the effort, right? And that's why it's really important you focus on maximizing that 20% of effort and minimizing the 80% that isn't as fruitful for you, right? 80% of the population has about 20% of the wealth, and 20% of the population has about 80% of the wealth. And this is not just true of one breakdown of the world population. This is true within segments of segments. So even within the billionaires, 80% of the wealth in the billionaire class is owned by 20% of the top billionaires, right? It's the same thing all the way up to the very top of the world, all the way to the very bottom of the world. Now, of course, most people watching this video are Americans, so there is going to be an American bias to the next few charts you're going to see. What you see here are the income gains of the low and middle income households being dwarfed by the very top. So this is the percentage change of incomes after transfers and taxes since the year 1979. And the top 1% you see in red, they have had a 326% gain all the way up to the year 2021. The next 19% below them have a 116% gained. The bottom 20% have a 132% gain, and the middle 60% have about a 73% gain. So of course, when you're measuring things in terms of dying political currency units, everything's going to trend up. However, who gets the most wealth? The top 1%. And of that top 1%, the vast majority of wealth in that top 1% is in the top 0.2%. The top 0.2% has more wealth than the next bottom 0.8%, right? Pareto principle and distribution all the way up to the top and the bottom. Now, this red arrow is pointing to the year 1971. And as you probably know, a lot of things changed in 1971 with the change of leaving gold, now adopting the Nixon standard of a political currency backed by nothing, not even gold. And what you can see here is that productivity has continued upwards, about 240% when measured in American dollars, but only about 115% up in compensation. Now, there's something interesting to note here. Obviously, we're measuring from the lens of fiat dollars and not measuring from the lens of Bitcoin. So obviously, the numbers here are not going to be entirely accurate. However, I think it's really interesting to note that the top 1% have had an increase since the 1970s, late 1970s, of 326%, whereas productivity has grown by about 240, 250% or so right now. And of course, this chart is even more outdated a few years later. But the point is that the one income bracket that has kept up with productivity is the top 1%. Why would that be the case? Well, the bottom 80%, 90% or so, they are earning incomes based on exchanging their time for dollars. But the higher up you are in global wealth rankings or American wealth rankings, the higher the probability you are a business owner or a business investor. And a business owner and business investor can maintain its rate of progress with productivity. It can raise prices to keep up with inflation. And so my point here is that the real problem people have is not necessarily about being angry about wealth inequality. The real problem they have is that it feels unfair, it feels unjust. And most people aren't properly identifying the sickness. And so instead, they're confusing the symptoms as the actual underlying disease, right? The sneeze is not what's causing the problem. It's the cold that's causing the problem. Most people aren't thinking critically enough or just aren't educated enough to understand the difference between the two. As an example, going back even further in time, you can see that wealth inequality and income concentration declined a very solid bit between the 1940s and the 1970s and late 1970s, right? And why would this have been the case? Well, there's something really interesting that happened between the 1940s and into the 1970s, and that is that the dollar was on a gold standard. When you had productivity more accurately measured by a gold-backed political currency instead of a fiat-backed political currency, what happens is that it becomes more difficult for people in the top elite ruling class to entrench laws and rules in favor of themselves at the expenses of others. This is called the Cantillon effect, right? The closer you are to the source of money creation, the more you benefit. So those really, really well connected, right? The politicians, the lobbyists, the people that are close to Washington, D.C., and the money printer coffers that come from there, those are the ultra wealthy people that have excellent connections that help them entrench their wealth, right? Then the entrepreneurial class, let's say the rest of America, right? We are stolen from in that reality, right? Americans are stolen from this wealthy class as they're printing a bunch of political currency. However, everybody else outside of America is in trouble even more than those in America, right? As much as Americans might complain or whine about wealth inequality and this and that, the other, the reality is that there's even more wealth inequality between the poorest American and basically everybody else in the world, right? 80% of the world, there's that 80% number again, 80% of the world makes less than $30 a day. Very few people in America make less than $30 a day, right? And people are, struggling, right? But even people with minimum wage, they're making, let's say, $7, $10 an hour, even if they're having a hard time getting by, they're probably working more than 3 hours a day on average, right? And so my point is that, yes, as much as Americans have a right to be upset with the unfair system causing the wealth inequality, they actually shouldn't be mad at wealth inequality itself. In a fair market system, in a free market, wealth inequality is the result of somebody producing more wealth than somebody else, right? You can think of it as like goodwill tokens, right? Hey, I'm going to do something helpful and nice to others, and I'm going to stack up these goodwill tokens as a reward for doing something that's good. So in a political currency, when the money is not earned by doing good, useful work and effort to help other people, that's where people then start to become upset with wealth inequality. If you appreciate this video, please like, subscribe, share this video with other people. It really does help out a lot. It helps YouTube see that this is not a Bitcoin or crypto, scamming channel, right? A lot of the scammers out there, with all the, fake channels and fake AI, Michael Saylors and everything else, right? Please, we need to make sure that this message stays out there for everybody and that we don't let this get into the YouTube, apocalypse, right? And that, it's helpful at killing the bots. In the comment section down below, having the good metrics to the YouTube algorithm gods helps make sure that everything else is a much more streamlined and smooth process to do. So please subscribe. It really does help a bunch. Now, let's get back to our main questions before we get to the wealth ranking chart. So why do we care about rankings so much? Well, it's because our human brains are very limited. They're very finite. And actually, the easiest way for us to tell if we're doing something good or not is to compare ourselves to something else. It's a lot easier to compare us to one other position and then feel good or bad based upon that instead of reflecting on all the positions, right? Many Americans are not happy with how much money they have or where they rank or where they feel they rank because they're comparing themselves to their immediate peers instead of comparing themselves to the entire world. It's much easier for our finite human brains to just look at the thing closest to us and compare ourselves to that instead of elsewhere, right? You can be the poorest person in a group of billionaires, but still feel bad because you're the poorest billionaire in the room. Whereas the reality is that if you were actually thinking intelligently and you were thinking with true logic instead of, the emotional comparison you're making, you would see that actually you're doing very well. The same thing is true with pretty much everybody watching this video to a much lesser degree. That's why we care so much about rankings. We care more about where we rank relative to others than we care about absolute wealth and purchasing power. This is why I think it's really important. Yes, it's fun to talk about the rankings, but ultimately you should be grateful about your lifestyle and quality of living more so than where you rank when compared to anything else. Then the other question, why do people get so angry at wealth inequality and why is it a problem or why it potentially is not? Well, people get so angry at wealth inequality because they feel like things are unfair, because it is, because it's a political currency system, And in our limited finite human brains, we only know how to compare ourselves to others. And when we compare ourselves to those that have significantly more than us, and we have the context of feeling like things are unfair, then we make that simple assumption that the people being more productive are harvesting wealth to themselves at the expense of everybody else, which, to be fair, is kind of true. Compensation is not keeping up with productivity, and only the top 1% is really keeping up, breaking even with how much more productive we've become over the last few decades, right? But the problem is not that those people are being productive and that they are being business opportunists and creating businesses. The real problem is that political currency is being created at no cost, at no expense. And this means that those that are spending the cost of their own time, their own human lives to gain that political currency back in the form of income, those are the people that are having wealth siphoned away from it. The problem are not the business owners that have all the political currency flocking to them. The problem is that there are people creating this currency out of thin air. So that's why we care about rankings so much, and that's why wealth inequality actually is not a problem. But let's actually look at the visuals of what we're looking at here. What you see in this chart here are 3 tiers, right? You see 3 large blocks of 1,000 symbols of people, 1,000 examples. Every single person in the bottom tier there represents 1/1,000th of the global population. Okay, the second tier, the middle tier, is each one of those people represents 1/1,000,000th of the global population, 1/1,000th of 1/1,000th. And the third tier at the very top, each one of those represents 1/1,000,000th of the world population, 1,000th of 1,000th of 1,000th of the world population. So the second tier is an expansion of the top person, the top 0.1%, and that third tier is an expansion of the top 0.1% of the top 0.1%. Now, Satoshi Nakamoto, you can see in orange at the very top left hand corner of the screen. Michael Saylor is somewhere in the second person from the left, right? Michael Saylor is a part of a very small group of, a dozen people or less that have a tremendous amount of Bitcoin, and he's probably going to have even more Bitcoin in the future as his company continues to buy more Bitcoin. The folks like Tim Draper, the Winklevoss twins, all those kinds of people, they're also in this category. It's a very small, tiny elite group, right? On this entire graphic here, that entire section makes up a few people. Then you have Donald Trump in yellow over on the right compared to them. And what you see, obviously, is that, this is a very, very, very tiny section of people, right? Donald Trump now, him and his family indirectly, they have something like 10, 15 or so thousand Bitcoin or so. So they're a little farther to the right. However, they're basically still up there, right? There are probably less than 100 families in the world that own nearly as much Bitcoin as the Trump family does. Now, zooming back out here, where do you sit? Well, that green guy over there, later on in this top section, he is somebody that represents somebody with 100 Bitcoin. Let me zoom out to the entire graphic here, right? So if you own 100 Bitcoin or more, you are this green person. So you are also in this upper section. Now, the reason why I think this is really interesting is that when I say if you have 100 Bitcoin, you have more in common with Michael Saylor and Donald Trump and Satoshi Nakamoto than you do with the average person in the future. This is why. If you had a graphic where you had 1 million dudes in white here, right? Like literally, if you had a graphic where you get rid of this third tier and you expand this graphic, the second tier, and you had a slide here, instead of with 3,000 people on the screen like you see here, you had 1 million. Okay, if you have 100 Bitcoin, you would be the top guy. If you were Donald Trump, you'd be the top guy, right? Literally, both the people with 100 Bitcoin and the Trump family with 10,000 Bitcoin, both of you are in the top 1 and 1/1,000,000th of the world population, right? It's like you have more in common with the billionaires than you do with the plebs, right? If you are a person with, 100 grand and you're looking up at somebody with, $500 billion, like let's say Elon Musk or somebody, or you're looking at somebody with $5 billion, like to you, they look basically the same. I know to the person with $5 billion, Elon Musk might feel like he's in an entirely different category, but to the reality when compared to everybody else, you're basically in the same position, right? Sure, that one billionaire has 1,000 times or 100 times or 50 times as much money as the, lower billionaire does, but at the end of the day, like, it's still unrelatable to the vast majority of people, right? And if you have 100 Bitcoin, which again, don't get me wrong, it's a lot of Bitcoin, right? But there's probably at least a couple of people watching this video that have 100 Bitcoin, right? Like you guys literally have more in common with the challenges and the opportunities of the mega billionaires out there in the world, right? Now, let's go beyond the top 1 in a million person and let's expand a bit further. if you have 10 Bitcoin, you're the guy in pink here, right? So if we had an imaginary chart that had a million dudes in white here, you would not be the top one in a million. If you are a 10 Bitcoin holder and this pink person, you would be the 7th person in line on this chart of a million people, right? And so people that I have these conversations all the time that they have, 3 Bitcoin, 10 Bitcoin, 30 Bitcoin, and they think that they're too late. Like, you are not too late. You have 10 Bitcoin and you picked a million random people in the world and you lined them up and you had 10 Bitcoin. Like, you probably are like the 6th, 7th, or 8th person in line of those million people, assuming that the world in the present moment and the future continues to follow a Pareto distribution, right? That's how much Bitcoin you have. It's a crazy, stupid amount. I don't think you understand how many people a million people is. Now, continuing down this line, if you had this line of a million people, if you were Donald Trump, you'd be the first person in line. If you have 100 Bitcoin, you would still be the first person in line. Okay, if you have 10 Bitcoin, you'd be the 7th or 8th person in line. But if you have 1 Bitcoin, you're still relatively early on in that line. You'd be about the 90th person in line. Again, out of a million people, you'd be the person in purple as seen on this chart here. So you may feel like with 1 Bitcoin, oh, boo-hoo, I don't have enough Bitcoin. I wish I had 1.5 Bitcoin. I wish I had 3 Bitcoin. I wish I had more. But the reality is that there's no need to complain, right? When comparing yourself to everybody else in Bitcoin, right? Like, you might be in a room with 90 people and you have only 1 Bitcoin, and the other 89 people in the room have way more Bitcoin than you, right? You're in this room of 90 people and you're complaining about your 1 Bitcoin, and literally everybody else in the room has more Bitcoin than you. So you feel like you're too late. Man, this person has 8 Bitcoin. That person has 27 Bitcoin. That person has 395 Bitcoin. That person has 10,000 Bitcoin. Wow, I'm so late. Man, bummer, dude. But leave the room and get in line, buddy, because those 90 of you are the first 90 in line, and there are another 999,910 people yet to be in line behind you. So you're definitely not too late to Bitcoin with only 1 Bitcoin, right? Because if the whole world is eventually going to adopt Bitcoin, then inherently there can't be more people in that room, right? There can only be so many people in that room with a Bitcoin, a few dozen Bitcoin, or a few hundred, or a few thousand Bitcoin, right? Now let's go even smaller. Let's say you're somebody that's not yet a whole coiner. You're still trying to get there, and that's great, right? Let's say you have 1 million sats, 0.01 Bitcoin. You're the guy in blue here. Now, because 1% of 1 Bitcoin is not nearly the achievement that 100 Bitcoin or 10 Bitcoin, even 1 Bitcoin is, we don't have the need to have a million people in our line to emphasize the point. We can shrink the line a lot. We can shrink it by 3 orders of magnitude. Instead of a line of a million people, you can have a line of 1,000 people. And in that line, you're going to be about the 19th or 20th person in line. So if you have a million sats and you feel like you're too late, because it is true, 1 Bitcoin is a much larger achievement than 1% of a Bitcoin, and you should definitely strive for more Bitcoin if you have only a million sats. Like, you should definitely not quit. However, you can still feel pretty good about yourself and that you still had a very good achievement. In the far future, if you picked 1,000 people at random from the world and you only have a million Satoshis, assuming you don't buy any more Bitcoin in the next few decades, guess what? You're still probably going to be in the top 20 or so of that line of 1,000 people. Like, you're still probably easily going to be the top 5%. So yes, don't stop at 1 million Satoshis, but keep buying more sats. And if you're watching this and you already have multiple whole coins, every single time you stack another 1,000 sats, keep that in mind. Every single additional million sats you're buying, you price out 1 person down the line, right? Again, talking to my, multi-whole coiners or multi-deck whole coiners here, right? If you are person number, 8 or person number, 25 or person, number 90 in line of this line of a million people, every single additional, boom, smash buy 5 million sats, boom, smash buy half a Bitcoin, boom, smash buy this, every single time you do that, you're looking way down the line and you've just kicked somebody out of a spot down the line, right? And it means that there's less Bitcoin for everybody else down there, right? And this is why I think a Pareto distribution is the best way to think about Bitcoin wealth in the future. The more people understand that there's not enough Bitcoin around for everybody to have a given number of Satoshis, the higher the incentive for people to buy more. The higher the incentive for people to buy more, the more they buy. And the more they buy, the less Bitcoin there is left for everybody else to join that line with a given Satoshi stack. Now, this is not a bad thing. Because when the Cantillon effect forces up the prices of real estate or food or oil, people starve, right? If you kick somebody out of the line on the housing ladder, people become homeless. If you kick people out of line on the affordability of energy ladder, then people freeze in the winter, right? And so that has a human cost, and that's the unfortunate reality of political currency. But the beauty with Bitcoin is that even though every single time you're buying another million sats, you're kicking people from out of the top 5% of the line, right? So yes, even though you're still doing that, the reality is that you're only pricing them out of a certain Satoshi stacking goal, right? It doesn't matter if their prosperous way of living is denominated in 1,000 sats or 1,000,000 sats, right? It's just a number, right? You're not forcing anybody to go hungry to be homeless, right? And this is the beauty of Bitcoin and why it is a superior world wealth ranking system and why it is a superior way for people to determine where they rank on the global stage. Because in the current political currency fiat world, to determine where you rank in the political currency world is to inherently have somebody else be a loser. Every single additional house you buy, every single additional amount of equity stock that you're pumping up to an even higher premium, the more difficult you're making for everybody else to get by. And that's why we're seeing such an affordability crisis, is because people need to preserve their purchasing power. But in order to preserve your purchasing power in a fiat political currency system, it requires that somebody else out there is not able to afford as much for the same amount of time that they're sacrificing in their income. So this is why Bitcoin is way better. And because Bitcoin is better, wealth inequality is not going to be less. There will be a greater amount of wealth inequality in the Bitcoin network because it is much more fair. It is not having wealth siphoned away. It lasts immutably, so that wealth inequality compounds over time instead of resetting every few years, every few generations as the political currency resets. Wealth inequality in Bitcoin is going to be tremendous. Something I've not shown on this chart here that's really important to mention is at the bottom, 52% of people in the world, right? You got a line of 1,000,000 people. You're probably in the top 100 or top 1,000 people in this line, right? If you have a line of 1,000,000 people, the bottom 520,000 people have less than 4,000 Satoshis or 8,000 Satoshis or 2,000 Satoshis, right? The bottom half of the world has less than 10,000 Satoshis, assuming this model continues to be true. And this is assuming all 21 million Bitcoin are run by individuals, right? Forget the fact that Satoshi owns 1,000,000 coins, right? Forget the fact that nation states are going to be buying, right? The point is that way fewer sats than you think are going to be generational wealth in the future. Of course, the caveat is you're going to have to wait a few decades for that to happen. However, it's probably going to happen. You are probably going to be able to retire on 0.01 Bitcoin, just for the reason alone being that by owning that amount of Bitcoin, you're already in the top 5% of the future world, right? And I think that even that may be conservative. I think it actually could be way more bullish than that, but I think I've said enough in the video. So if you appreciated the information on this video, please like, please subscribe. It gets this information out there in the YouTube algorithms. It gets more people watching this kind of Bitcoin only content instead of all the other, more garbagey stuff. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Hopefully this was useful to you, not only thinking about where you rank in terms to everyone else, but also thinking about why we compare how we rank to others, and also thinking about if wealth inequality in of itself is a problem at all. So thank you for your time. Please subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.